Hello, my name is Ben Secor, and this is my presentation for the first wiki in the Hegel seminar. This one is on the Sittlichkeit. The goals for this presentation is briefly go over kind of Hegel's project and the spirit chapter of the phenomenology of spirit. Also going to try to define some terms that kind of like define some terms through the various interpretations of Hegel. The main sources that I used were the paper that was posted by Brandom, and then also the videos by Dr. Gregory Sadler. And then thirdly, we're going to try to draw an essential connection between Geist or spirit and Sittlichkeit, as well as the interrelation between spirit, consciousness, and reason. And a lot of that is going to be based off of Dr. Sadler's discussion, and then also some textual evidence that I found in the book that I feel kind of supports my conclusions. And then fourthly, we're going to investigate the primary relation between the in itself and the for itself as they constitute reason within the sixth chapter of the phenomenology of spirit. And that's going to also be kind of based around Dr. Sadler's discussion, and then also my interpretation of those passages that I was mentioning. And then fifthly, we're going to finally kind of draw this like kind of delineation between like Sittlichkeit and like this immediate Sittlichkeit that kind of Brandom talks about in his paper. And I think that the kind of severance from the immediate Sittlichkeit to more of the kind of actual ethical essence Hegel has as mind is kind of promulgated by the failures of Antigone and Oedipus. And so we'll talk about that. And then there's also some other examples of how the characters within the two plays, Antigone and also in Oedipus Rex, like how they embody kind of the interesting kind of societal movements that were going on in ancient Greece. And that's going to tie in nicely to kind of the project that Hegel has throughout the chapter. So from the research I've done and also from reading the sixth chapter Phenomenology of Spirit so far, it seems clear that the goals for Hegel within this chapter are he wants to kind of trace the movement of spirit or Geist through these like historical shifts, and he seems to be doing this by analyzing both classical literature and as we'll see, kind of events that happen in history, such as like the French Revolution and also like Enlightenment thinking. In the classical literature, obviously, like these plays he's talking about, like Oedipus and Antigone. He also seems to be kind of elucidating the Enlightenment as the end game of these historical shifts. So it doesn't seem to me like these shifts are kind of heading nowhere, if that makes sense. And so as we'll see, there's kind of this like dialectic that's formed. And a lot of times, like we'll see different historical aspects in conflict with one another, and these conflicts aren't just completely self-destructive. So it's kind of like a common understanding in the Hegelian dialectic that the negation of like a preposition doesn't really lead to its like complete annihilation. Usually, it's kind of like if you have one historical event, then the negation of that historical event kind of in conjunction with the original event kind of leads to a synthesis of something new. And so it seems like Hegel is kind of pushing towards the Enlightenment and almost this more rational or enlightened kind of human thinking. And we'll talk more about what that looks like, because I think it's an important definition that we're going to go over, because it ties in directly to the next couple slides. I think that he's also kind of using a phenomenological interpretation of human inquiry to set the stage for an ethical theory within this book. And by that, it seems clear he's kind of setting a groundwork for how he's going to be talking about some of these things, and also how we should deal with these issues and the importance and kind of looking back in history and reflecting upon things, which is going to be a huge portion of his project to come, as we'll see. So the first term that I think is kind of important to get acquainted for, at least for the argument that I'm going to be making, is the Geist or the spirit. So I have a couple quotes here from paragraph 438 and also paragraph 440. First one reads, "Reason is spirit, since the certainty of being all reality has been raised to truth, and it is itself consciously aware of itself as its own world and as the world itself." And so that's the basically the project of this spirit to Hegel. So it's a little bit more than kind of like the idea of like, oh, you have a a soul, some immaterial soul, and that soul is striving to kind of understand the world and interact with it. And Hegel kind of views it a little bit differently. While the soul is certainly doing that, it kind of has like a deeper, more complex aspect to it. It's the consciousness that has reason. And so I really like Dr. Gregory Sadler's interpretation of this, I think, the best, where he kind of roughly interprets it as the spirit as kind of a striving towards like a collective consciousness within society. And so when Hegel talks about the Geist or the spirit, it is in reference to like the individual level, no doubt, but it's also this more kind of collective consciousness of where the almost like where society has been, basically. And so it's like a reflective, like looking back. Brandom calls it like Geist is Hegel's collective term for everything that has a history rather than a nature, or put otherwise, everything whose nature is essentially historical. So that's pretty interesting to me, because it seems like a prerequisite for Geist is to have a history. And then if we kind of put that basically in correlation with what Dr. Sadler has to say, it's almost like the history is essential for the spirit, and it's the spirit's job to kind of form this collective consciousness and understanding of it. And as we're going to talk about more, we'll talk about what exactly this consciousness is and how this really fits into kind of Hegel's materialistic historical beliefs. So two other terms that Hegel uses pretty extensively throughout the entire book is the in itself and the for itself. And both Brandom and Dr. Sadler have slightly different interpretations of this. And I think it's interesting. I think Dr. Sadler's kind of has like a more classical interpretation of what these words mean. And I think his interpretation has been picked up in a lot of, people who, I guess you could call them like footnotes to Hegel. So like Jean-Paul Sartre, like a lot of his definition of the for itself and the in itself, I feel like, and the way he uses it strongly aligned with how Dr. Sadler uses it. And I think Brandom kind of presents actually an interesting, different take on it. But so basically, Dr. Sadler kind of presents like the in itself as being. It's like it's most easily thought about as kind of like something that's like being in the world, and its whole kind of being is predicated off just simply presence. So objective objects have being; they are in themselves. What something is basically in itself. Meanwhile, the for itself is kind of like the I, or like the cogito, the consciousness. So we kind of like what is in the world versus the self-consciousness. So some things don't really have a for itself. Sartre might argue that, some things kind of can have an in itself predicated on your for itself, and that's also a Hegelian kind of notion, like the master-slave kind of dialectic, but that's something I'll probably talk about later. Anyway, Brandom kind of sees it a little bit differently. I think he acknowledges this delineation that Dr. Sadler has made, and it's kind of the more classical interpretation, but he also presents this interesting notion that the in itself is kind of a form of like practical understanding, and that's to be found like in the world. And so like we can run into these practical understandings and these practical morals, and these are kind of things we bump into in the world, and they're not predicated at all on what we ourselves kind of think or our consciousness. And then he also believes that the for itself is a kind of knowledge found to be normatively within oneself, if that makes sense. So the for itself is these moral kind of guidelines that we come up with on our own consciousness, and that they might not be very present outside the world, even though they are kind of like a posteriori understanding, as in like they're necessitated by reality. They're not given to us by reality. They're kind of imposed upon reality by ourselves. And as we're going to see, the kind of delineation between these two morals is going to become imperative within the works of both Oedipus and Antigone. And then finally, we got a quote from paragraph 438. This is kind of going to be a precursor to what we're about to talk about. So Hegel says, "In what has been the observer, reason is the pure unity of the I and being, of being for itself, and of being in itself, is determined as in itself or as being." And so that's kind of interesting. It's basically talking about how like reason and this kind of Geist, the spirit, is the combination of both the in itself and the for itself. So it is somehow the combination of something that is in itself and for itself, which Sartre is going to pick up on and say that's impossible. That's kind of a side note, but it's an interesting notion in that it's basically saying that the goal of reason is to understand itself as this basically like combination of the for itself and the in itself, which is pretty unique. It's basically saying like the consciousness needs to understand itself as an object. What is that object? That object is a synthesis of being and also self-consciousness. And so we'll talk about that more because that's going to become pretty important here in the next couple slides. Alrighty, so this is kind of like a little roadmap that I've designed here, just based off some of the quotes that I found in Hegel and also some of the interpretations. So if we kind of follow this around, the almost top little triangle there with reason, Geist, consciousness, I think that's important, but I think it's a little bit superfluous to kind of like the greater point. So we'll just kind of go over that quickly. Reason is like the spirit or Geist, which is consciousness, and consciousness is that which has reason. So those are all, that's kind of like a nice way of saying like these things are all very, very intimately interconnected with each other. I think the bigger point, the takeaway that's going to be really important for this argument is that reason is both being in itself and the I, the for itself. And so here I have like some textual basically evidence for my conclusions here in this diagram. So we have paragraph 438. Reason is spirit, as we can see that's reflected in the diagram. Since the certainty of being all reality has been raised to truth, and it is self-consciously aware of itself as its own world and as the world as itself. We then have paragraph 440, spirit is consciousness that has reason. And so that kind of completes that little triangle up there. Finally, in last one, that's one that we just kind of talked about in the last slide, which I think is very, very important, is that reason is in itself and for itself, but it sees itself as this synthesis, which I think is crucial. And it sees itself as this synthesis as a being. So it sees itself as the in itself and the for itself as an object, as this like unity and as this synthesis. And that's going to be important because one of the big kind of goals of Hegel is going to be to describe reasons coming to understand itself as an object, right? And so spirit is going to be coming to kind of understand itself. This collective consciousness needs to understand itself as this unity. And as we'll see, that's not immediately the case in Antigone and Oedipus. And Hegel uses these historical kind of plays and historical events to basically track this movement, track this understanding, depict how reason comes to understand itself as this perfect unity, as the synthesis. And it's actually probably not perfect unity. It's a very kind of like, as we're going to see in the ancient Greek kind of, plays, it's a very almost like warlike dialectic. So we have this kind of like inner fighting between the two and this conflict, and it's going to lead to like the synthesis and new understandings of basically how humans interact in the world. So more of that to come, but if at any point people kind of get confused, like, oh man, I kind of forgot what the general gist of this was. This is my interpretation based off of Dr. Sadler's and also Brandon's kind of presentation, is that this is kind of the general structure or something like it that Hegel's working on. And like I said, the most important part is that interrelatedness between reason in itself and the for itself. So the next important thing to do for this presentation is going to be to tie the spirit or the Geist to the Sittlichkeit and kind of talk about how they're similar. So in paragraph 439, Hegel is referring to Geist when he says that its, meaning Geist's, own spirit, spiritual essence, has already been marked out as the ethical substance being Sittlichkeit. But spirit is the ethical actuality. So that means that even though this kind of Geist is predicated on the Sittlichkeit, the only way that Sittlichkeit or the ethical substance can be materialized in a reality or actualized is through Geist. And so like, what is Geist? So we have substance in the universal, which is Brandam's kind of definition of the for itself and the in itself. The for itself being the universal, substance being the in itself. So in itself are these morals you bump into in your regular life, and the universal being for itself like religious or personal held beliefs. So substance in the universal, self-equivalent and enduring essence, is the spirit of the solid and undissolved ground and entry point of the doing of all. This substance is equally universal work, which generates itself with the doing of each and every one as their unity and identity. So as we're seeing now, the kind of universal or basically for itself interpretation of the world is becoming important to the actualization of this ethical substance or Sittlichkeit. Spirit is the materialization of Sittlichkeit. This can only occur through a collective consciousness of both the in itself and the for itself. So it's important that this like Geist, this collective consciousness or spirit, reflects on kind of the interrelation between for itself and in itself universal and practical knowledge and morals, things we find objectively in the world and things that we kind of come to find within our own heads and our own moral beliefs. It's important that as a society we reflect on these two aspects of things in order to allow this actualization of the ethical substance to occur. So in order to achieve this kind of Sittlichkeit, it's important that we do this kind of reflecting move. And as we'll see, this is kind of how we bring about this actual ethical substance. This is going to be different than the immediate Sittlichkeit that's present in Antigone and Oedipus, and that's an interpretation I agree with, presented by Brandom, is that there's a difference between the Sittlichkeit and the immediate Sittlichkeit, and we'll be talking about that here shortly. So this is just another brief summary, kind of tying together where we've been in like that nuts and bolts section, and then also kind of where we are now that we've interpreted the relationship between Geist and Sittlichkeit. So Geist is a consciousness of reason being for itself and in itself as an in itself. We've already covered that kind of ad nauseum. Like that's hopefully like that makes sense. And if it's still a little bit opaque, the prior slides describe it pretty well, I hope. Geist, furthermore, is a consciousness of reason being in itself the synthesis of the for itself, the our universal, and the in itself, the being or substance. Geist must then recognize reason as being this synthesis. Only then will it become for and in itself. The important thing here is I've kind of tied together the two notions of for itself and in itself. So I've kind of talked about how the for itself is both the I, the cogito, and the kind of universal morals you might find in things like, religious beliefs or like really strong held beliefs to like family ties, and things that you just hold innately within yourself that you believe in and find valuable. And the in itself, on the other hand, also being a synthesis between what Dr. Sadler and Brandom has to say of the being, kind of like the ontological, like things in the world, or substance, meaning like, the possibly the ethical things that you follow along, but they don't come from yourself. So maybe they're the rules of government. Maybe they're, you help a elderly lady across the street with her groceries, like things that are more kind of like expected of you in society, the things that you're expected to do. You bump into these morals in your outside world. These morals don't come from your head. You might decide to follow them, but they're not created by you. They're almost imposed upon you, but yet they're still morals. And the action of Geist is realizing itself as both the in itself and the for itself. So once you can realize yourself as this synthesis, then once we have like a collective consciousness of that action, then we have an actualization of this Sittlichkeit. And that is kind of basically how you can actualize the ethical substance to Hegel, or Sittlichkeit. That's how you can actualize the goal of Geist. And you can make it material. And you can make it, you can make it like have an impact. And that's kind of what's going to lead, as we're going to see, like part of these like Hegelian dialectical movements, is the actualization of this ethical substance that only comes about due to the reflection. So moving on to more of the specifics of the plays Oedipus Rex and Antigone. These are kind of like some general motifs I think are going to be important to keep in mind throughout this discussion to come. And these are the motifs I think that Hegel mentions explicitly, and are very important to talk about the actualization of Sittlichkeit and the change from immediate Sittlichkeit to the more legitimate Sittlichkeit that occurs between the two plays Oedipus Rex and Antigone. So in both Oedipus Rex and Antigone, women are keepers of the home affair and the religion, while men participate in the governance of the state. So immediately right now, we can have these two almost like diametrically opposed forces. So we see on paragraph 465, nature is not contingency of circumstance or choice, allots one sex to one law and the other to the other. Or conversely, the two ethical powers give themselves their individual being and realization of the two sexes. So that's interesting because Hegel here is claiming that it's not just, random luck that women have been allocated to the, keeping of the home and the keeping of religious beliefs, and men have been allocated to, the keeping of the state, right? It's not contingent or choice. That's how it is. That's how it just is in nature. It couldn't be any other way to Hegel. There is no contingency. There is no circumstance. That is what it is. So I think that's an important kind of motif here to think about as we move on. Furthermore, we have values are to be found in the world. The individual only plays the role of discoverer where morality is concerned. And now this is going to become very important as well, because what's happening here is that is kind of going to form the basis of the immediate Sittlichkeit, is basically people in the ancient Greek society, they're governed by like what they are to do. What is their duty? What do you do in society? And those are not really dictated by what's in your head. If it's the religious, spiritual belief or the beliefs by the state, both of them, neither of them are actually determined in your head. As we're going to see, like that religious thought will eventually kind of turn into like a pure and rational understanding later in the chapter, but now it's not there yet. Right now, all the religious thought is it's the same as kind of like the rules imposed by the state. It's something you run up and you bump up against, and then as an individual, your normative beliefs in your head don't impact the spiritual religious belief, which, as I said, will change later in the book, but that's currently where we are in the Greek society. Likewise, the same thing with the state rule. That's not impacted either by your normative moral beliefs that you have in your own mind and that you've come to through a pure rational kind of creation of ideas. They just are there to be encountered by you. So we see this in paragraph 469. We have, so actuality keeps the other side, which is foreign to knowledge, hidden within itself, and does not show itself to consciousness in the way that it is in and for itself. The son does not show to the father and the assailant who he slays, nor the mother and the queen who he takes wife. So that's basically talking about how these morals are there in the world. And so when the son, in the case of Oedipus, when he kills his father and marries his mother, the things in his head don't matter, right? The actual moral substance is being hidden from Oedipus. It's only after he commits these crimes does the full scale of the morality of his actions reveal itself to him. And what he did and what he felt while he was doing it is irrelevant, because at the end of the day, he killed his father and married his mother, and all that matters is the objective truth, and that objective kind of truth goes against the moral beliefs held by both the religion and or probably the state. And so now, even though Oedipus might have an inclination, which I don't think he does, there's no evidence that he does in the book because he admits to it right away and he gouges his own eyes out, but he's holding himself to this belief that it doesn't matter to him that he didn't know. That doesn't matter. His knowledge doesn't know. The universal understanding doesn't matter. All that is important and basically the application of this moral code is what happened. And so that's a really great example of Oedipus quite literally going and bumping up against these morals. And that's what we're going to talk about later in the next couple slides, which is going to form the basis of the immediate Sittlichkeit as opposed to the actual kind of ethical substance that'll be apparent at the end of the discussion. So to now kind of expand on this idea of the immediate Sittlichkeit, the roles of men and women, there's kind of two aspects to this. The first aspect is that the roles of men and women are to be found in the world. They are contingent but implicit, right? Haven't been explicitly described yet. That's just kind of how it is implicitly in society. Furthermore, in order to promulgate a transcendence from immediate Sittlichkeit, there needs to be a consciousness of the interaction between the for itself and the in itself. And so, as we kind of talked about briefly in the last slide, in the case with Oedipus, and also you can see this in Antigone as well, where so in Oedipus, when he kills his father and marries his mother, all that matters is the act of killing your father and marrying your mother. His ignorance towards the fact that that was his father or mother don't allow him to escape from his actions. And so basically all that's mattering here is the in itself. The for itself and the conscious understanding of Oedipus doesn't matter. Likewise, in Antigone, when she goes out to bury her brother, and then the heads of the state, they come looking for her because they're all mad that she did that. All that matters is the action. Basically, the people who are really mad, really hunting for, it doesn't really matter to them. It doesn't really register the kind of for itself understanding that she has. So we have these two diametrically, completely opposed things that are both basically completely objectively true to the people who have committed these actions. At least in the case of Antigone, it's objectively Antigone, being a female, thinks that's her duty, is she needs to uphold the values of the home and the religion. Meanwhile, the leaders of the state think it's their objective duty to uphold the values of the state, and we desecrate our enemies and leave them laying in the sand for the vultures. And so we have these two things that are held to be objectively true by those who hold them. These things are completely in themselves, and they have no recollection of the for itself on the other side. And this is what kind of is going to start creating this conflict that's going to be important to basically transitioning from immediate Sittlichkeit to the more pure ethical substance that was kind of talked about earlier. So there needs to be an understanding of this conflict, right, between the individual morals to be found in the world. That's what we just talked about. So there needs to be an understanding of these two objective forces coming together. And there also needs to be an understanding of this universal kind of religious belief held by the keepers of the home and females, and the practical state powers held by the governances. And so that's where the dialectic here and the basically conflict is going to stem from, as we'll talk about. And that is what I think is most kind of prominent in these two plays, is this like immediate cyclic height, and it describes the transcendence from this immediate cyclic height, which only values these in itself things to be found in the world. And as we're going to see through these conflicts, what's going to be born out of them is an understanding and an appreciation for the actual kind of for itself morals and the intentions behind things and the emotions you felt while you were doing things, and the subjective experiences of doing an action are now going to impact the moral and ethical substance and start forming the actual cyclic height and transcend us away from this immediate cyclic height that's simply just found out there that we just encounter. So just to further elaborate on the point and really solidify it, immediate cyclic height in Oedipus Rex he's really a perfect example of this immediacy of cyclic height. His actions are the only thing that matter, and his normative and universal values do not impact the moral worth of his actions. So, his ignorance towards his mother being his wife or his father being his assailant that he killed, the fact that he's ignorant of that doesn't excuse him. All that matters is the objective things that happened. The fact that he killed him and married his mother, that's all that happened. And that's an immoral thing that he bumps up against. The immediate cyclic height is presented as a realization only of the in itself, in the foreign in itself structure that really composes human reason. So, as we talked about in the nuts and bolts section, we talked about reason being this for itself and in itself structure, but immediate cyclic height is not the actualization of that entire structure. Immediate cyclic height is only the actualization of the in itself. It's only basically the immediate ethical substance, the ethical substance present in the world. It has nothing to do with kind of what, Oedipus felt, the remorse that he felt, the confusion that he felt. Doesn't matter. None of that matters. Geist only has a consciousness of the in itself component of reason, as we just said. Here's a quote from Hegel in paragraph 467. He says, "Therefore, the absolute right of the ethical consciousness is that the deed shall be nothing other than what it knows." So the deed is only what it is. The deed is only as it knows itself. It doesn't matter how Oedipus knows the deed. It doesn't matter how anybody else knows the deed. All that matters is how the deed is, how the deed knows itself to be itself. So that's basically saying that the deed is the only thing that matters. The emotions, everybody else's opinion of it, all superfluous. Doesn't really matter. The only thing is his immediate morals that he's bumped up against and the deeds that he committed in objective reality, and that is all the Oedipus is being based off of. And the fact that that happens, the fact that people are reflecting on that and actually imbuing that into society is immediate cyclic height, because it's the actualization of this, essence, this spiritual essence. It's not the correct spiritual essence, I don't think, as Hegel will talk about, but it is a spiritual essence being imbued by this community. So in the play Antigone, we're going to get a very, very good example of kind of the Hegelian dialectic that's going to free us from this immediate cyclic height into the kind of really the real cyclic height that's going to then be expanded on, I think, in the further sections to come. So there is not only one in itself present within the ancient Greek society, as we've seen, and this is better exemplified in Antigone, where the females and the, keepers of the home, they have an in itself objective belief about the world different than the leaders of the state and a lot of the males kind of running the government, meaning that like they both, so Antigone, when she wants to bury her brother, it's tempting to think that that's like a normative, universal moral belief that she's come to of her own conclusion, but it's not. It's basically kind of been equally imbued upon her by the state. This is not a pure rational undertaking as like the pure religion will be leading up to the Enlightenment. This is a different, like Hegel's going to talk about this kind of like pure rational religion present in like the Jesuits, and this is a different thing. This is basically Antigone following customs. This is not a pure rational understanding of religion. And so what we have here is these two objective beliefs, one held by Antigone, one held by the state, and they're going to be clashing, obviously, when she wants to bury her brother. And so, in the act of burying her brother, she opposes an in itself moral present in the society she lives in to appease a different in itself moral equally present in society. So, we now have this two conflicts, right? And so, we have immediate Sittlichkeit being actualized two different ways, and that's going to create a conflict within itself. So she reclaims her brother from the clutches of the in itself moral propagated by the state in favor of the religious in itself moral. So she's going to deny the moral by the state in favor of her own religious moral. We then have a couple of quotes here by Hegel, one on paragraph 152. The dead man is an empty singularity, merely a passive being for another, surrendered to the irrational individuality and forces of absolute matter. So Hegel's talking about, like, once that man is dead, he's kind of at the mercy of these two in itself things to determine his being in the world, right? Because he's no longer able to determine his being in the world anymore. That's up to other people. And so is his being in the world going to be determined as a desecrated corpse on the battlefield to be picked apart by vultures, or is his being in the world going to be tied back to the family? Is it going to be tied back to the, blood of his kin and his brothers and the culture and all this, deep understanding of things that's not purely rational? It's not being, made up inside Antigone's head and her own beliefs. It's being dictated by the culture. And so we then have on paragraph 153, thus the ultimate duty consists in the fulfillment of the divine law, namely the positive action vis-a-vis a single individual. So basically he's saying, the only way to reclaim this dead man, from the clutches of the battlefield is to perform your duty and fulfill the divine law, the divine law that's governing the cultural movements and religious beliefs, but is diametrically opposed to the law of the state law. They're very, very different. And so this two kind of objective clashing of the two in itself is going to really expose how it's necessary to kind of try to imbue this, like, for itself understanding. So if you're the leaders of the state, it's important that you start to realize, oh my gosh, well, this person, even though this is a terrible, terrible enemy who tried to assault our city with a whole army and killed a bunch of our troops, it's still a human being. And so this person who wants to give that dead man the rights that they see appropriate, they're going to start to see some value in that, hopefully. And that's how we kind of transcend away from this immediate Sittlichkeit. That's how we kind of transcend away from this ethical substance that's purely determined on in itself things we bump into in everyday life. And it's only once we start doing that that we can almost start getting in touch with, like, the true meaning of, like, Sittlichkeit, after we get away from this immediacy. Once we realize that everything is not just present for us to be discovered, it's also important that how people feel, the emotions associated with it, the actual drive behind their actions. Because, like, Antigone's not doing this to hurt the state. That's not why she's doing this. She's doing this to kind of, like Hegel says here, turn this empty singularity into something with meaning to the family, and it's a noble cause. It's her divine law. It's her divine right. It's what she's supposed to do in her own mind. And so the state, it's important that they realize that, and that they kind of come to this more for itself understanding, and they start to realize the consciousness behind these actions is not just a diametrically opposed in itself. And likewise, in the case of Oedipus, it's equally important, if the whole society would have realized Oedipus's, actual things, like, oh, he didn't know, it was a mistake, then maybe they wouldn't have, ostracized him so severely. And if Oedipus himself realized that, maybe he wouldn't have, gouged his own eyes out. So that's the important kind of dialectical shift that needs to happen through this conflict. And I think it's perfectly described in Antigone in particular. So building off what we previously just talked about, in paragraph 472, we have Hegel saying, the movement of ethical powers against one another and the movement of individualities that put them into life and action have only reached their true end when both sides experience the same downfall. For neither power has precedence over one another. Only in the equal overthrow of both sides is the absolute right fulfilled. Ethical substance, or Sittlichkeit, has emerged as the negative power that engulfs both sides. The almighty and righteous destiny has made its entrance. I really love this little phrase here, because it like just talks about, like, perfectly what we're kind of talking about is, like, only after we have an overthrow of both sides. Well, which two sides? Overthrow of the sides of the, I see this really, really prominent in Antigone. Overthrow in the, objective morals held by the government and the objective morals held by the culture and the church, and not the church, but I don't really quite know what it would be called in ancient Greek, but the religious life, only after both of those objective in themselves are overthrown and engulfed by the negative power of this actual true Sittlichkeit has the almighty destiny made its entrance. And what the almighty destiny is the introduction of the for itself into reason. And so basically what we'll talk about here in this next slide is that no longer, after we have this overthrow, after we have Sittlichkeit replace immediate Sittlichkeit present in the world, only then will we have reason be coming to start, like reason will start recognizing itself as a combination of both the in itself and for itself. And that's the almighty destiny that's about to make its entrance. So in the following paragraphs, we have Hegel elaborating on that very idea. We have paragraph 475 claiming that in the representation, the movement of human and divine laws expresses necessity in individuals. So right now, this law is being expressed on the individual level, instead of an in itself to be encountered in the world, in whom the universal appears as a pathos in the activity of their movements as their individual doing. So we no longer have the individual doing determined by like the doing in itself, right? We don't have like the action is only the action in terms of the action's consciousness of itself. We now have basically the universal appearing as a pathos in the activity of their movement as their individual doing. So the actual understanding of the doing is now becoming more important. We then have paragraph 477. The absolute essence reflects that very empty destiny into itself is nothing other than the eye of self-consciousness. So, this kind of like reflection upon the eye of self-consciousness is filling in for this conflict. It's arising out of this conflict that came between these two in itselves. It is only through a conflict of the two in itself morals within Antigone that a synthesis can be reached of the eye of consciousness, and can be reached, and the eye of consciousness is legitimized as a structure of reason, whereas with immediate Sittlichkeit it was not. But we know that Sittlichkeit, the ethical substance, is the actualization of this consciousness, of this kind of like understanding that reason is both the for itself and in itself structure. So the conflict that Antigone runs into implicitly embodies the for itself consciousness of what is ethically correct, and this for itself consciousness is given validity through the conflicting in itself morals. So it's only through understanding the motives behind what Antigone was doing that we can start to create this space between the two in itself objective truths that are being imbued upon people within the ancient Greek society, in whom they think it's the people of the Greek society think it's their duty to follow, while in reality it's only through kind of realizing the morals and intentions behind things that we can create this rift and start to actually get the true structure of reason. So in conclusion, I think at the end of this section, Hegel leaves us with what was the immediate Sittlichkeit now is not so immediate Sittlichkeit. I think we're now getting closer to the rational understanding that will lead us into the Enlightenment age, and as we'll see in the next wiki, probably the thoughts promulgated in the French Revolution. To the immediate Sittlichkeit as that which is independent of consciousness is now replaced by the Sittlichkeit described in the beginning of this presentation. So this is now Sittlichkeit being the actualization of Geist, and then Geist and reason being the in itself understanding of reason as both the for itself and the in itself, and not purely just reason being the in itself as was present in Greek society. And reason being this basically tool of the in itself. Reason's only job was to find in itself in the world, and then if you're Oedipus, gouge your eyes out once you go against the morals, and if you're the heads of state, to prosecute Antigone for just trying to do what she thought was correct. So truths are no longer simply found to be present. They are in part determined by human consciousness, and this is the nature of the project that I think is going to be further developed in the book, or the chapter rather. And so I'm really excited to see where it goes. I hope everybody enjoyed the presentation. It's a bit long, but hope it gave some insight, and hope I was accurate with my representations. Thank you.